They expect you to break first. That's not an assumption, it's a calculation, one they've made 100 times before with 100 different people, and up until now, it's always worked. Because here's what a narcissist believes, deep in the architecture of how they see the world. No contact isn't a boundary, it's a bluff. It's a move in a game they think they're still playing, and every game in their experience has always ended the same way, with the other person cracking under the silence, reaching out first, proving once again that they were never really gone, just testing the waters of a threat they never actually intended to follow through on. So if you've just gone no contact with a narcissist, if you've blocked the number, deleted the photos, told yourself today is the day you finally stop checking if they've posted something new, I want you to understand exactly what's happening on the other side of that silence, because it is nothing like what you'd expect from a person who claims to have loved you, and understanding it in full is the thing that will keep you from breaking first. Let's start with the immediate reaction, the one that happens in the first hours and days after you disappear from their line of sight. It will not look like grief. It will not look like remorse. In most cases, it will look like almost nothing at all, a strange, unsettling calm, because their first instinct isn't to feel the loss. It's to test the boundary casually, the way you'd tap a door you expect to be unlocked. A text that says nothing, really, or thinking of you, or something engineered to require a response without actually saying anything worth responding to. Not because they miss you, because they're checking whether the door is actually locked, or whether, like every other time, it just looks locked from the outside. When that doesn't work, when the message sits there, unanswered, unread, undignified by even the smallest reaction, something shifts. This is where most people expect the story to end, with the narcissist simply moving on, finding new supply, forgetting you existed. And for a while on the surface, that's exactly what it will look like. But underneath that surface, something far more calculated is happening, something almost nobody talks about because it doesn't fit the story we want to believe about justice, about karma, about narcissists finally getting what's coming to them. They expect the silence to be temporary, not because they have any evidence that it will be, but because their entire understanding of relationships is built on a single, unshakable belief that they are the prize, and that no one walks away from the prize permanently. This isn't arrogance in the way we usually think of arrogance. It's something closer to a delusion built out of necessity, because the alternative, genuinely believing someone could see them fully and still choose to leave for good, is a thought their psychological architecture cannot hold without beginning to collapse. So what do they do while they wait for you to break? They perform, loudly, publicly, sometimes elaborately. This is the part that will test you more than anything else, because it is designed, whether consciously or not, to reach you even through a wall of silence. New photos posted at exactly the frequency that suggests a life going wonderfully. A new relationship announced faster than seems believable, dripping with language that echoes, a little too precisely, the language they once used with you. Mutual friends casually mentioning how great they seem, how happy, how thriving, in a way that feels less like an observation and more like a message being relayed through a third party, because they know, somehow, that word travels, and word is the only channel left open to them now that you've closed every direct one. This performance is not evidence of healing. It is a signal flare, sent up in the hope that it reaches you, that it makes you doubt yourself, that it makes you wonder whether your absence registered at all. And here is the thing you need to understand with absolute clarity. The intensity of that performance is directly proportional to how much your silence is actually working. Because a person who has truly moved on doesn't need an audience for it. They don't need to broadcast their happiness at a volume specifically calibrated to reach the one person who stopped watching. The performance only makes sense as a message, and a message only makes sense if there's someone they're still trying to reach. This is where the second phase begins, the one they expect even less than the first escalation. If the casual, low-effort message doesn't work, if the performance doesn't crack the silence, most narcissists move to something with more weight behind it. A message that manufactures urgency, an emergency that conveniently requires your input, a mutual friend checking in on their behalf, a memory posted on the anniversary of something significant, timed with a precision that only makes sense if you understand it as a calculated probe rather than a coincidence. Some will escalate further still. A message dressed up as concern for your well-being, laced with just enough guilt to make silence feel cruel. Just enough manufactured vulnerability to make you question whether staying quiet makes you the villain of a story you didn't choose to be in. None of this, and I want you to hold on to this fact more than any other, is about missing you the way you understand missing someone. It's about restoring a system that has fallen out of balance. You were never just a partner to them. You were, whether you ever agreed to the role or not, a source of regulation, a mirror, an audience whose absence creates a specific, unbearable kind of static they don't yet have the tools to sit inside. And that static is only just beginning. Because here's what they don't expect. Buried underneath every calculated message and every performance engineered to reach you, the static doesn't resolve. It compounds. Most narcissists have never actually experienced sustained no contact from someone who mattered. This is a crucial detail, one that changes everything about how the rest of this unfolds. In every previous relationship, in every previous rupture, there was always a way back in. A shared friend group that made total silence impossible, a moment of weakness where the other person reached out first, a slow fade that never quite closed the door completely. What they're facing with you is unfamiliar territory, and unfamiliar territory, for a nervous system built entirely around control, is its own particular kind of terror. So when the messages don't work, when the anniversary post gets no reaction, when the manufactured emergency gets no response, when the guilt-laced concern lands in a void that doesn't even give them the satisfaction of an angry reply, something in their strategy has to shift. And this is where most people watching from the outside expect them to simply give up. That's not what happens. What happens instead is more unsettling, because it reveals exactly how deep the need for resolution actually runs. They start gathering intelligence, not always consciously, not always with a clear plan, but functionally, that's what it becomes. A mutual friend gets a slightly too casual question about how you're doing. Your social media, if it's still visible to them in any form, gets checked with a frequency they would never admit to anyone, including themselves. Sometimes it goes further. A new account unfamiliar to you, following you, or people close to you, watching from behind a wall they think you can't see through. This isn't romantic longing dressed up as curiosity. It's the same instinct that made them scan a room for threats to their image while you were together. Now redirected entirely toward the one variable they can no longer control: what you're doing, how you're doing it, and most importantly, whether you're doing it without them. Here's the part that will genuinely surprise you. If you've spent any time believing the story that they simply don't feel things the way other people do, this waiting, this watching, this compulsive tracking of a person who has completely disappeared from their direct line of sight, it is genuinely uncomfortable for them. Not in the way heartbreak is uncomfortable for you, not with the same textures of grief and longing and aching memory, but uncomfortable in a way that is, in its own right, a kind of suffering, because it forces them to sit with a reality their entire identity was constructed to avoid, that they are not, in fact, the exception, that someone did see the whole picture, decided it wasn't worth staying for, and found the strength to make that decision permanent. This is the moment their expectations start to genuinely fracture, because up until this point, everything has operated according to a script that's worked before. Test the boundary, perform for an audience, escalate if needed, gather information, adjust strategy, try again. but the script has an ending built into it. The moment where the other person finally responds, finally breaks, finally proves that no contact was never real to begin with. And when that ending doesn't arrive, when weeks become months and the silence holds, unchanged, unmoved by anything they've thrown at it, the narcissist is left facing something they have almost no practice facing, a story that doesn't end the way they need it to. This is when the anger arrives. Not the performed anger, not the version calibrated for an audience. The real, private anger that surfaces in unguarded moments, in arguments with the new partner that seem to come from nowhere, in a general, simmering irritability that people close to them start to notice and can't quite explain. Some of this anger will get redirected at you, even in your absence, reframed in their internal narrative as evidence that you were cold, that you were cruel, that your silence proves you never really cared the way you claimed to. This reframing isn't really about you at all. It's a defense mechanism, a way of converting an unbearable truth, that they were left and stayed left, into something more survivable, that you were simply too damaged, too unstable, too incapable of real intimacy to appreciate what they offered. But even that story has a shelf life, because stories require an audience willing to believe them, and the people closest to a narcissist, over enough time, start to notice the gap between the story and the pattern. They notice that this unstable, cold person who left is, by every visible account, doing better than they've ever done, building a life that looks calm, steady, unbothered by the narrative being spun about them from a distance. They notice that the narcissist's next relationship starts showing the exact same warning signs the last one did, on a compressed timeline that makes the pattern harder to deny. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, the story that was supposed to protect the narcissist's image starts working against them instead. This is what they never expect when they first send that low-effort, testing the water text in the hours after you go quiet. That this isn't a game with a familiar ending, that the silence they're used to treating as temporary, as a bluff to be called, as a door they'll eventually find unlocked again. This time, it's real. And a mind that has spent a lifetime avoiding the discomfort of things being permanently, irreversibly out of their control has almost no framework for what to do when it finally happens. So they keep circling, keep checking, keep performing for an audience that stopped watching a long time ago, without ever quite admitting to themselves that the performance has no one left to convince but them. And somewhere in that circling, in the checked profiles, the manufactured emergencies, the anniversaries posted into a silence that never breaks, something else is happening that they genuinely, completely failed to anticipate. You're not waiting for anything anymore. That's the piece they can never quite compute, because it falls so far outside the script they've operated by their entire life. In their experience, silence from someone who loved them has always had an expiration date, a breaking point where longing outweighs pride, where the ache of missing someone finally overrides the resolve to stay away. They're not just hoping you'll break. On some level, they need you to, because your continued silence isn't just a rejection of them. It's evidence against a belief system they've never had to seriously question before. That love, real love, always eventually comes back around if you just wait long enough, perform long enough, apply enough pressure at exactly the right angle. But no contact, done fully, isn't a test of endurance you're trying to win. It's not a strategy calibrated to make them suffer, and it was never meant to be a message sent in code, waiting for them to decode it and come crawling back with the right apology. It's simply the absence of a person who finally stopped extracting her own well-being to fund someone else's need for an audience. And that distinction, the difference between silence as tactic and silence as genuine, structural peace, is exactly what they cannot detect from the outside because they've never experienced it themselves, not once, not with anyone. This is why the story doesn't resolve the way they expect. There is no dramatic final confrontation where they get to deliver the speech they've been rehearsing in the shower, The one where they finally make you understand what you supposedly threw away. There's no satisfying collapse on your end that lets them return to the narrative where you were unstable, where you were cruel, where your leaving proves something broken in you rather than something finally permanently healed. There is only the silence continuing, indifferent to their timeline, unmoved by their performances, uninterested in restoring a balance that was never actually balanced to begin with. And in that unbroken silence, something happens to them that no version of the script prepared them for. They start to change. Not through growth, not through the kind of reckoning that leads somewhere better, but through erosion. The version of themselves that only existed through your attention. The charming one, the misunderstood one, the one whose worst moments always had someone standing by to translate them into something forgivable. That version doesn't survive long without a witness, and without you there to hold that role, without a new person yet fluent enough to replace years of practiced management. The parts of them that were always the loudest, the most demanding, the least patient, start to show through in front of people who no longer have any reason to look away. Meanwhile, you are becoming something they will never get to witness and never get to take credit for. A person whose sense of worth no longer depends on being chosen by someone incapable of choosing anyone well. The silence you're keeping isn't punishment. It isn't leverage. It's the natural, quiet consequence of finally understanding that some people cannot be reached through more patience, more explanation, more of your own dwindling reserves of hope that this time finally they'll meet you halfway. You didn't go no contact to make them suffer. You went no contact because staying reachable was costing you pieces of yourself you'd already spent years trying to rebuild. And here is the truth this entire story has been circling from the very beginning, the one they will never let themselves fully understand. They expected your silence to be about them. A test to pass, a door to eventually find unlocked, a performance to outlast. What they could never have predicted, because it exists entirely outside anything their psychology equips them to imagine, is that your silence was never about them at all. It was about you. About the version of you that finally stopped needing their understanding to feel complete. That finally stopped waiting for an apology substantial enough to justify everything you endured. That finally, quietly, without asking permission, chose peace over the exhausting project of being chosen back. That is the ending they never see coming, because it isn't an ending that includes them in any way. While they're still checking profiles that no longer update with them in mind, still performing for an audience that walked out of the theater a long time ago, still circling a question they'll spend years avoiding. You're simply living, building a life with room in it for people who don't require management, learning what it feels like to be loved without having to earn it through constant vigilance. Discovering that the silence you were so afraid would break you was, instead, the exact thing that finally let you breathe. They expected you to break first. Instead, you became the one person in their entire life who never did. And somewhere in the quiet that follows, long after the messages stop, long after the performances lose their audience, long after the story they told about you stops making sense, even to the people who once believed it, they'll understand, whether they ever say it out loud or not, that the silence was never a door waiting to be reopened. It was the sound of you finally, permanently, walking